October 22, 1956. Deep beneath a quiet Parisian suburb, in a secluded villa, three nations convened in absolute secrecy to draft the death warrant for an entire geopolitical order. They signed a document that would dictate a military invasion, but the real war was already being waged in the shadows, a war where the primary enemy wasn't the supposed target, but the Western world's own future stability. How could a desperate attempt to salvage imperial pride result in the unforeseen, decades-long empowerment of the very religious extremism they sought to contain? The official history paints the Suez Crisis as a blunt confrontation between Egyptian nationalism and fading European power. But that's the surface. Beneath the noise of the ensuing invasion, a secret protocol was finalized, known only by the codename Operation Musketeer, detailing a coordinated ambush by Britain, France, and Israel against Gamal Abdel Nasser's secular pan-Arab regime. The planning climaxed in the Protocol of Sèvres. This was not merely a military agreement, it was the blueprint for conflict. The terms were explicit. Israel would attack the Egyptian army in Sinai, providing the necessary pretext. Then, Britain and France would intervene, ostensibly to separate the combatants and protect the vital Suez Canal, leading to the occupation of key waterways. The documents detailing this collusion, tucked away in the archives, confirm the dates. October 22nd through 24th, 1956. The machinery of war, set in motion by a calculated lie. On the night of October 26th, the Israeli Air Force struck the Sinai Peninsula. The advance began immediately. Then came the roar of the naval landings on November. Royal Marines and paratroopers dropped onto the sands of Port Said and Port Fouad, expecting swift victory. The sound of the initial blasts, the high-frequency crackle of radio chatter coordinating the amphibious assault, echoed briefly across the Mediterranean before being drowned out by the world's outrage. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in London, referring to their aggressive action as Operation Musketeer, believed they had executed a flawless strategy, finally wresting control from Nasser, who had dared to nationalize the canal in July. But empires rarely die quietly, and their desperate last acts often sow the seeds of long-term chaos. Even as British forces secured their foothold, a secondary, far more insidious operation was being funded from the coffers of the British Treasury. This was the truly destabilizing secret. In the immediate aftermath of the failed invasion, as international pressure, particularly from the United States, forced a humiliating withdrawal, these same former colonial powers turned to asymmetrical warfare. Their target was not just Nasser's military, but his very ideology, secular Arab nationalism, which threatened French and British influence across the region. The chosen weapon was the one group Nasser had consistently suppressed, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Imagine the classified ledgers, the faint imprint of official stamps on disbursement records authorized between 1957 and 1958. These weren't large, obvious transfers, they were covert injections of capital, designed to revive and sustain the Brotherhood's underground network. The objective was simple: use religious fundamentalism to destabilize the secular government from within. The transaction was a Faustian bargain made in the cold aftermath of military defeat. The Brotherhood, an organization that preached a return to a religiously defined state, received money intended to undermine a leader who stood for modernity, socialism, and Arab unity. The architects of this covert funding, French intelligence operatives and their British counterparts, believed they were executing a surgical strike against Nasser's influence. They saw the Brotherhood as a manageable, albeit radical, counterweight. The irony, the catastrophic failure of foresight, became apparent almost instantly. While Nasser's secularists were temporarily weakened by the Suez debacle and the internal strain of managing the crisis, the Muslim Brotherhood survived the post-operation crackdown. The funding didn't just keep them alive, it allowed them to refine their structures, conceal their finances through proxies, and deepen their reach into disenfranchised segments of Egyptian society. The 1950s were a time when the West believed it could compartmentalize political violence, using religious zealotry here to fight secularism there, believing the fire could be contained. The intelligence reports from the era, if they were ever fully declassified, would likely show a dangerous optimism, a belief that the Brotherhood's ideological goals aligned sufficiently with Anglo-French strategic interests to keep them loyal allies. But the funding created an infrastructure. It provided the necessary breathing room for recruitment and ideological propagation. while Nasser's secular military and political apparatus was under intense scrutiny from the Soviets and the Americans. The small amounts of covert cash, when channeled through the Brotherhood's sophisticated methods of mixing legitimate and illicit funds, acted as a powerful fertilizer. The intended result was regional fragmentation. The actual result was the creation of a hardened, well-funded Islamist opposition that would outlast Nasser. Decades later, that very same infrastructure, nurtured by that immediate post-Suez subsidy, would morph and radicalize, influencing global jihadist movements. The short-term tactical victory of undermining a secular rival turned into a long-term strategic defeat for the West and the entire region. The plan to control the narrative by backing the excluded religious faction backfired spectacularly, forging the very opposition that would come to define Middle Eastern conflict for the next half-century. The noise of the 1956 invasion faded, but the echo of those secret treasury transfers continues to reverberate. Chapter 3. The Doctrine of Proxies. The pivot from conventional military occupation to covert financial support marked a fundamental shift in Western foreign policy, a strategic surrender disguised as pragmatic adaptation. When Operation Musketeer failed to immediately topple Nasser, the intelligence agencies of Britain and France did not abandon their objective of regional hegemony, they merely changed the tools. They recognized that direct military confrontation with a rising nationalist power, especially one backed by the growing shadow of the Soviet Union, was politically unfeasible in the post-war climate. The new doctrine was clear: foster internal dissent using ideological adversaries. This doctrine of proxies was not unique to Suez, but its application against the Muslim Brotherhood demonstrated a chilling lack of understanding regarding the nature of religious extremism. Secular nationalism, for all its flaws and authoritarian tendencies, operated on a predictable geopolitical playbook: alliances, trade agreements, military balancing. Religious fundamentalism, however, aimed not just at state control but at societal transformation, a vision incompatible with long-term Western interests. The documents detailing these shadowy subsidies reveal a calculus based on immediate utility rather than historical trajectory. French intelligence, still reeling from the loss of Algeria and acutely sensitive to any pan-Arab sentiments spilling across the Mediterranean, prioritized neutralizing Nasser's propaganda machine. Nasser's secular message was poison to French colonial lingering sentiment in North Africa. If the Brotherhood could occupy the ideological vacuum in Cairo, that influence would surely diminish across the Maghreb. In London, the Foreign Office viewed the situation through the narrow lens of oil and trade routes. Nasser's actions threatened the flow of commerce, and disrupting his domestic support seemed a less costly alternative to another costly military campaign. The money flowed quietly, often laundered through Swiss accounts or channeled via ostensibly neutral charitable foundations that served as effective conduits for political warfare. It was the perfect deniability, a phantom expenditure that left no traceable battlefield markers. But ideologies, once financed, rarely remain subservient to their initial paymasters. The leaders of the Brotherhood, having survived years of brutal suppression under Nasser, were adept survivors. The influx of capital, modest by state standards yet revolutionary for an underground movement, allowed them to pay informants, secure safe houses, and, crucially, print and distribute literature that bypassed state censorship. They began to paint Nasser not just as a secularist but as an apostate whose alliance with atheistic communists made him an enemy of true faith. This narrative proved devastatingly effective. While Nasser's popularity remained high among the masses who benefited from land reform and state-sponsored education, a growing, educated, and deeply religious middle and upper class began to see the Brotherhood as the untainted alternative. The covert funding didn't just sustain the organization, it refined its intellectual core, allowing figures within the Brotherhood to develop sophisticated theological justifications for political violence that moved beyond simple reactionary politics. They were learning how to speak the language of modern opposition while maintaining an immutable core of religious dogma. The failure of the Suez invasion had shattered the myth of European invincibility. The subsequent covert funding campaign shattered the myth of Western control over its chosen instruments. By 1959, as Nasser consolidated power and purged remaining Brotherhood members with renewed vigor, the movement was stronger, more ideologically rigid, and better networked than it had been before the invasion. The resources poured in by former colonial powers acted as a life support system, preventing the movement from being entirely eradicated by the Egyptian security state. This period, 1957 to 1960, represents the true ideological incubation chamber of modern political Islam. It was here, in the shadows funded by the West's desperation, that the blueprint for future confrontation was drawn. The strategy was supposed to be use the religious right to destroy the secular left. The unintended consequence was the cultivation of a transnational Islamist movement whose enemies included not only Arab nationalists but also the Western powers whose treasury unknowingly fueled their rise. Chapter 4. The Long Echo. Gamal Abdel Nasser eventually died in 1970, his vision of a unified secular Arab state fractured by internal strife and external pressure. Yet the seeds planted during the Covert funding era continued to germinate across the Middle East and beyond. The infrastructure nurtured by British and French clandestine budgets during the late 50s proved remarkably resilient, adapting to new political